Hello everyone, I'll go over a very nice game from round 7 of the US Championship played between Zviad Izoria and Hikaru Nakamura. And after 6 rounds, Hikaru was surprisingly at only 50%, 3 points out of 6 rounds, and he had all draws, 6 consecutive draws, which was very unfortunate for him and very unlike him, because he usually plays very aggressive chess and manages to convert, and especially in time trouble, because he gets a huge advantage when he is low on time and his opponent is low as well, because he is the best blitz and bullet player in the world, arguably. Perhaps Magnus Carlsen is better, but that could be discussed. And Zviad Izoria had a great US Championship. Despite only having 2.5 out of 6, he actually had a great decisive results against some of the strongest players in the field, and he won against Caruana, and he drew Wesley So and Akobian, and this was his 4th toughest matchup, I would say, perhaps 3rd, because Akobian is supposed to be weaker than Caruana. However, this was the toughest opponent he had to face in the rest of the field. And Nakamura, of course, had to win, finally had to win, and he had the black pieces, so you could expect an aggressive setup such as the King's Indian, which he played already this championship. So Zviad Izoria opened with knight to f3, the reti opening. We have g6, e4, bishop to g7. This is now the Zukertort, Kingside Fianchetto setup. d4, the most common move, d6, bishop to c4, knight to f6, and this is now resembling a King's Indian defense if you only imagined the pawn being on c4 and not the bishop. But this is a setup that Nakamura likes and knows very well. Queen to e2 now, defending the e4 pawn, both sides castle, knight to c6, e5, striking aggressively at black's knight and at f6. And surprisingly, Nakamura already made a losing mistake in this position. Now, okay, your knight is attacked, and you can see that if you retreat it to d7, there's e6 in the position, which gives white an almost decisive advantage, because after e6, f takes e6, bishop e6 check, and a move such as d5, white is simply better. You can imagine the bishop being on e6, the pawn on d5, and after c4, this setup is too strong, white's center is too advanced, and black stands no chance. So the logical move would be knight to e8, and after knight to e8, e6 works, but not that well, because e6, black would play d5, and after ef7, rook f7, bishop to b3, black is much better, and this bishop is out of the game. If the bishop goes to d3, then the d4 pawn is falling, because the knight and the bishop are attacking it, so it doesn't work. So knight to e8 would be better for black if white makes a mistake of pushing e6, but if he doesn't, then black couldn't really be punished because of knight to e8. Another move that could have been considered, which is the best option for black, however it's fairly tactically complex, but you would imagine Hikaru Nakamura of all people to be able to spot that, and that would be knight to h5. And if white starts preparing g4 with h3, and g4 would of course win the knight, trap the knight, then d takes e5 is possible, d takes e5, knight to d4, of course you can't still take the pawn, it's defended twice, but after knight to d4 you have to exchange your knight, knight d4, queen d4, and now if g4, black has a great resource in the position, and that's knight to g3 winning the exchange, because this pawn is pinned to the queen. So knight to h5 would work, however you have to calculate 5 moves in advance, but I'm sure Hikaru Nakamura is able to calculate much further, so he could have found knight to h5. However, after e5 he made a blunder and he played knight to g4, and this immediately gives white a huge advantage, because after h3 the knight goes to h6. Another move that black could try is counter-attacking the bishop with a move such as d5, but that would be too slow and not good enough, so knight to h6 is the best move, but this knight is now out of play, and you could get it to f5, but that's wasting another tempo to get the knight into the game. Now Zviad Izoria continues with knight to c3. Another move is rook to d1, just creating an x-ray on the queen and threatening to open up the center. And now Hikaru Nakamura plays another absurd move, freeing up a space for the knight. He plays king to h8, and how he didn't find knight to f5 is a mystery. And in the not the press conference, but in his conversation with the commentators after round 6, so the round previous to this one, he said that he is missing moves, and he had a great move in round 6 which could have secured a winning advantage, but he didn't find it, and he actually said he didn't even consider the move. And perhaps the same thing happened here, because if you're playing knight to h8 in order to play knight to g8, I'm sorry, you're playing king to h8 to play knight to g8, what kind of advantage are you planning to gain, and how can you even equalize? So after knight to c3, he could have played knight to f5, and after rook to d1, simply e6, reinforcing the knight, creating a square for the knight if g4 should happen. Of course, before rook to d1, if after knight to f5 g4 is played, then simply knight takes d4, is winning a pawn and winning the position. So knight to f5 was perfectly playable, and he had to calculate only 2 moves in advance, and what's the point of king to h8? However, after king to h8, Zviad Izoria's advantage is now overwhelming already, and engine-wise, practically speaking, positionally speaking, and soon materially speaking, he is winning. And if you look at the pieces, white has a significant space advantage, significant advantage in piece activity, king safety, pawn structure, and central control. So I don't know how this could have happened to Hikaru Nakamura of all people. Now Zviad Izoria continues with the most aggressive move, rook to d1, creating an X-ray on the queen, a6, preparing b5, a3, b5, and now bishop to d5, not retreating, but pinning the knight to the rook. Now bishop to b7 is played, bishop to f4, reinforcing the e5 pawn, queen to c8, finally getting away from this pin, bishop to e4, and now rook to b8. And he could have tried one move which could have helped him gain equality, perhaps in 10 or 15 moves. Instead of rook to b8, a more active move would have been f6, trying to disrupt white's central control. And after e takes d6, e takes d6, black would have been easier off, and he would have had some fighting chances with a move such as rook to e8. But still, it would have been much better for white. However, after rook to b8, Zviad Izoria simply moves his rook to e1, because black wasted the tempo by moving the queen to c8, and the rook is more active here, and the other rook wants to get into the game. Now we have d takes e5, of course d takes e5, taking with the pawn, increasing central control. And now knight to d8. Now the second knight is absurdly placed, but he wants to transfer it to e6, so it's kind of justified. And now if you try to compare the pieces, how is this rook compared to this rook? How is this rook compared to this rook? What prospects does it have? This bishop compared to this bishop. Okay, this bishop is equal to this one, they can be exchanged, but the knights especially are just far superior for white. These knights on h6 and on d8 are doing nothing at the moment, and the queen is more active as well. The queen on c8 is too passive and it's controlling nothing. After knight to d8, Zviad Izoria plays a simple developing move following opening principle, Morphy styles, getting all the pieces into the game, rook a to d1. Now knight to e6 is played, threatening the bishop goes to c1. We have knight to g8, the point of king to h8, and the point was obviously to get the knight to the worst square on the board, because f6 is of course covered by the e5 pawn, and if it goes back to h6, then it's just a waste of 3 tempi. Now we have bishop b7, rook b7, queen to e4, attacking the rook, c5, knight to d5, centralizing the knight, c4, knight to g5. We now try comparing the knights once more. We have knight g5, bishop g5. Now compare the bishop and the knight on g8 and on g7 to white's knight and bishop, and you can see that the position is far superior for white. And it's strange that Hikaru Nakamura let himself be so cramped in the position. He usually plays hyper-modern defenses, which often give his opponent much more space, but he always has something up his sleeve to open up the position and attack, and out of the blue he would create a menacing attack. But this game, it seems that he didn't even try, and there was a great discussion on some forums and in the chat and at chessgames.com, and one of the users actually pointed out the analogy between chess and golf, and he said that chess games would have been far more exciting had the players been given a bigger span in between rewards, depending on the places on the scoreboard. And in this tournament, the first place at the US Championship gets, I think, $50,000, and second place gets 35, and even the last finisher gets some money. And in golf, only the top 50% get paid at all, and the rest get a trophy or something, some recognition. And the difference between first and second place is actually 40%, and that means that you are going to fight to finish first or second or third. And you are not going to be content with the draw, and let alone with a minus score. And before this round, Nakamura was at 50%. So perhaps that was a great point to make, that if the rewards were delegated differently, the games would have been more fighting. But however, let's return to the game. Here Nakamura plays queen to f5, and white could consider taking the queens off in order to ruin the pawn structure, but if you have more space, just keep the queens on, you're attacking, and you have some interesting tactical possibilities with the knight uncovering an attack on the rook if the queen should move, and the doubled f pawns wouldn't be as much of an advantage as this space advantage is. So he plays knight to c3. Defending the queen and preparing to capture with the knight if Nakamura takes. Nakamura doesn't take, of course now the rook is attacked, so he could either trade queens or move the rook, or defend the rook. He plays rook f to b8, preparing the queenside pawn push, bishop to c1, a5, now g4 is played, forcing the queen away, queen to c8, and now queen to f3, simply attacking the f7 pawn. He defends with e6, locking down the structure, but now with this knight on c3, it's obvious that the weaknesses Nakamura made with e6 are terminal, and the knight after coming to e4 has two strong squares from which it could dominate the position. I would highlight the square d6, and if the knight gets to d6 or f6, strategically speaking, the game is winning. Now bishop to f4 by Zviad Izoria, first reinforcing the pawn, knight to e7, knight to e4, rook to c7, and now bishop to g3 is played, solidifying the bishop, getting some more king safety, and still preparing to enter the position with the knight. Of course, he could have... he is removing the bishop also to attack the f7 pawn, but he could have immediately played knight to d6 and captured this pawn. But he didn't. This is more solid. We have a queen to f8 now, defending, knight to f6, not going for knight to d6. And now rook b to c8, rook to d6, and all of white's pieces are now in the middle of black's position, and it's at the same time sad and exciting to see Hikaru Nakamura being crushed this way. And Zviad Izoria is the Kingslayer this tournament. He managed to defeat Caruana, he managed to crush Nakamura in this game, and he drew Akobian and So an astonishing performance by him. Here Nakamura goes badly wrong once again. He plays g5, a move which doesn't really have a purpose. He's preparing h6, defending the pawn, and at least stopping the white pawns from expanding further, but this was too weakening at the same time. We have knight to d7 now, attacking the queen, getting some more time on the clock before move 40, the time control. Queen to f8, rook e to d1, h6, now once again a repetition. Knight to f6, and at this point Nakamura decides to take the knight. He is done having to put up with this menacing knight on f6, bishop takes f6. And now both moves are good. Taking with the queen is okay, taking with the pawn is arguably better, because you have a strong mating net around the king. If he took with the queen, then king h7 of course has to defend h6, h4 opening up the position, g takes h4, and you take with the queen, because you want to play bishop to f4 attacking the h6 pawn, or you want to play f4. Soon after, queen to f8, defending the pawn, most probably f4, and now white has a strong attack and a big advantage, and in a couple of moves black is going to resign probably. So this was a great attacking chess. But after bishop f6, it seems more logical to take with the pawn, and it was a better move. So after e takes f6, knight to g6, queen to e4, and from this position on another move was possible, which I was looking at. He could have simply won a pawn with, of course, rook to a6, because this is uncovering an attack on the rook by the bishop. So now after rook to a6, he would have to exchange the rooks. However, the queen is still defending d1, so he doesn't have to take immediately. So simply rook takes a5, rook d1, rook d8, queen f3, and queen to d7. Black would have some more activity in the position, but it's once again completely lost. However, after knight to g6, Zviad Izoria didn't go for queen e4. Didn't go for rook a6, he played queen e4 because he saw that he can win the pawn in another matter. And Caruana now plays c3, we have b3, closing down the files, of course, a4, ba4, ba4, and now rook to a6, and the pawn is almost indefensible. Of course, Nakamura could try rook to c4, but that wouldn't really work. Now e5 is played by Nakamura, gaining some space in the center and blocking down the bishop from the diagonal, from the attack at the rook. Queen takes a4, taking with the queen and exchanging queens, and that gives away a lot of advantage, but it simplifies the position into an easily convertible endgame. So now queen a4, rook to c6, attacking the f6 pawn, rook to a5, attacking the e5 pawn, rook e8, defending, rook d to d5, attacking the second time, rook f6, rook e5, and of course he could have taken with the bishop, just not to lose the exchange temporarily, but this is more flashy, so rook e5, and of course after knight to e5 he can play bishop e5, pinning the rook to the king, so he will gain the exchange back immediately. Rook e5, now rook to a6, attacking the a3 pawn, but white is much faster to the c3 pawn, so he will be able to regain the material, or still stay a pawn up, that is. Now rook to c5 is played, rook takes a3, king to f1, king g7, king e2, king f6, king to d3. Now the c3 pawn, of course, is dropping, rook to a6, rook takes c3, king to e6, and this is now a theoretically won endgame. And usually rook and pawn endgames could be a draw, especially only one pawn up. And of course, with the same number of pawns, it's a draw in 90% of the games. However, this pawn is an outside passed pawn. It's not on the A file. That would be the best option, to have it on the A file. But the C file is far away too, and this is completely winning. And there's nothing black can do. This is a technically winning endgame, which, okay, you can't know if you are not a complete expert on rook and pawn endgames, which I think Nakamura is. But even if he knew that it was winning, perhaps he was waiting for a mistake from Zviad Izoria. But unfortunately for him, that didn't happen. We have king e4 activating the king. Now it will take some maneuvering, and it's not an easy conversion. You have to fight for it, but it's technically winning. Rook a4 check, king e3, f6, f3. I'm going to go through the moves a bit faster, just highlighting some key points. Of course, now Nakamura is waiting for white to make a mistake and to weaken the h3 pawn, but that can easily be defended. And your idea is to get the rook into the corner and force him away from a check to gain a tempo. So now the rook can't check, he has to move first, rook c1, and now you have time to advance. And his idea is to lock down the kingside pawn structure, lock down the pawns on h6 and f6, and that will make them easy targets. Now king e6, h5, locking down the structure. The king is cut off from entering the fourth rank. The c pawn is defended. The king is free to enter the position, and black doesn't have that many checks. King d6, attacking the rook, rook f5, king to e6, rook to f3, everything is defended once again, king e5, king f2, rook to c2 check, king to g3, king e6, and the position goes on, and this pawn is now starting to advance, the c pawn is moving forward, and in this position, of course, there is no more stopping the pawn, and white can easily trade off into a winning pawn versus king endgame, or a rook and pawn versus king endgame versus king and rook endgame, and this is now winning. King to f4, rook f1 check, king to e4, rook f2, rook to f3. Of course, if Nakamura had traded the rooks, this is a winning king and pawn endgame with rook f3, king c6. Despite the material being given, white is much faster to get to the kingside pawns. And in this position, of course, the h pawn is queening. There is nothing black can do. So after rook to f3, he played rook e2 check. We have king to f5 entering the position, rook to e5, king takes f6, rook to g5, and in this position, defending the pawn with rook to f4 is dropping the c3 pawn. So after king c6, this would be winning, but not that easily winning, as what Zviad Izoria played. This position is what you want to achieve, to get your king to defend the rook and prevent black from taking on g4. But after rook to g5, he played king to f7, temporarily giving up a pawn, the g4 pawn instead of the c3 pawn. And after rook g4, rook to f6, defending c3. And now it's busted. Rook to g5, attacking the h5 pawn. Rook takes h6, 2 pawns up, rook c5, and this is the position in which Nakamura was for about 10 moves playing on increment, and of course this is 90 minutes plus 30 minutes after move 40, so you have to get to the time control, and you get a 30-second increment per move after starting from move 1, so every move you make you get 30 seconds, and of course you know that Nakamura is the best bullet player in the world, so with 30 seconds he can win 2 games. He can play a simultaneous bullet exhibition, so you would expect him to manage his time well. However, after king to d7, rook to g8, in this position he started thinking he had 34 seconds on the clock, And at 1 second, he made a move rook to e1, and his flag fell. He flagged, and that was, of course, losing. He lost the game. It doesn't matter that the position is, of course, completely losing. Whatever black does, white is going to play rook to g6, creating a bridge not a bridge, a blockade, so to make sure that he can block the checks and get the king to the g file, queen the h pawn. So this is completely winning anyway. It doesn't matter. But Nakamura managed to lose on time, and I don't remember when that last happened. And okay, Caruana is having the tournament of his life. Nakamura is probably having the worst tournament of his life. Wesley So is unlucky with his opponents who are trying to draw, as happened with Sam Shankland yesterday. But all in all, this is a very exciting US Championship, and I'm happy to be covering it and watching the games, and I can't wait for the games today. Anyway, thanks very much for watching. I hope you liked this positional destruction of Hikaru Nakamura in the Zukertort by the great Zviad Izoria, and stay tuned for more chess. Thanks very much. Bye.